Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and today we're talking about Nekron, Lord of the Unliving. But before we get into that, smash that like button, make sure you're subscribed, and leave us a comment. That helps us out with the YouTube algorithm, but also we love to hear from you guys. We've got an awesome community here, and that's thanks to you. So thank you so much for being here. So, all that said, let's dive in. The prologue to today's game session takes place on Earth K in 2025, where what's left of the Anti-Monitor is now the central power battery for the Black Lantern Corps. And with it is Nekron, Lord of the Unliving. All the heroes dogpile Nekron, but he points his hand at a Green Lantern named Simon Baz, and Nekron has a 75 AP attack, where the light around his hand gets dimmer, and then he shoots Simon with a black ray of pure death itself. And Simon first dies, then rises as yet another Black Lantern. Dr. Manhattan sprays Nekron with acid, and that doesn't work. Lobo hits him with the atomic axe, and that doesn't work. Rogue even punches Nekron with that strength that she recently absorbed from Power Boy, making sure that she doesn't touch Nekron with her bare skin. She has the helmet of Juggernaut between her fist and the flesh of the enemy, at all times. But even that punch, when it takes Nekron into the negatives, where normally he should be knocked out, he isn't, right? He's already dead. So all of their attempts to hurt him fail. And that brings us to the main plot of this crisis. When Dr. Manhattan subbed his Omni power for neutralize, and in specific, he targeted Nekron's growth power. Dr. Manhattan rolls the dice and got 6 RAPs on table number 2. So we said that Nekron lost 6 APs of growth, making him smaller and lowering his body by 6 APs, which at first seemed like it would help. Lobo, on his turn, decided that maybe Nekron has tough hide on the outside, but if he could attack from the inside and go after the internal organs and stuff like that, maybe that would work. So Lobo, being Lobo, went in through the back door. And to be clear, while Nekron is smaller than he was before, he is still gigantic. He's like the size of a kaiju. So Lobo takes the atomic axe to the intestinal walls of the enemy, but it still doesn't seem to do any good. And as Lobo does his best proctologist impression, Rogue beats Nekron even further into the negatives, and he just keeps going. So the heroes have no idea what to do. And in our game over the years, whenever the player characters get frustrated and nothing seems to be working, there is one guy they always call on who swoops in and saves the day somehow. Every August, we play our big annual crisis game. And almost every crisis ever ended the same. And longtime listeners to the podcast will know exactly who I'm talking about. He was created by the old ones in space long, long ago. They waged a war against the star gods that took our hero into the heart of the sun itself. That war eventually ended, and the creators abandoned their creations, leaving those guys without purpose. So some of them slowly became corrupt and depraved. And out of that group, there was a smaller group that saw this, saw where things were going, and left. and they headed out into space looking for what they were going to do with their lives. And a ship of these alien soldiers crash landed in ancient Ireland, where the locals didn't know that the planet was round, let alone that there were other planets, right? And the name that they gave this hero was Dagda, which, by the way, just means the good God, right? It's not even a name, it's more like a description. And eventually, the time of the, quote unquote Celtic gods came to an end. And Dagda wandered, still looking for purpose. And interestingly enough, wherever he went, people referred to him as the bear in whatever their respective language was. So, like the French called him Oberon, spelled Auberon, which means bear. The Geats called him Beowulf, which literally translates as bee wolf, which was the name they gave bears in that culture. And in England, the citizens of Camelot called him King Arthur, right? Because Arthur means bear. And out of all of these myths and legends that this hero inspired, Arthur is probably the one he is the best known for, the most enduring, right? So it is Arthur who always comes to the rescue, and it is Arthur who snatches victory from the jaws of defeat over and over and over again, right? And the inhabitants of Earth K have grown to expect this from him. So their question right now is, where is he? Right now, he is fighting Black Lantern versions of Dr. Fate and Doctor Strange. And thanks to the Shaper of Worlds, who recently destroyed all symbols of authority, Excalibur, which was Arthur's symbol of kingship, right, was unmade. So Arthur's trying to do all of this empty handed. Point being, Rogue gets out her phone and she records a video of herself in front of Nekron, and she has tears in her eyes. And she sends this to her husband. And as she does, Nekron is tired of what Lobo is doing. So Nekron substitutes his sorcery for teleportation, and he puts Lobo, and by the way, only the character, not his equipment, into the core of the sun. Lobo dies, but then his invulnerability power kicks in and he is resurrected. And then on the next turn, he dies and is resurrected over and over and over again, right? And Lobo does not have the flight power, so he can't get out of the sun. Once Lobo is gone, Super Lion and Talkie Tawny attack Nekron. The lion uses heat vision while the tiger uses lightning. But sadly, neither attack seems to do any good. Also, and this takes some explaining, during World War II, the evil dictator of Germany was obsessed with various magic items. And he was always trying to get his hands on any relic that might be somehow useful to him, including Excalibur, right? And the Germans even had a castle called Webelsburg, which, by the way, was the inspiration for Castle Wolfenstein. And that was going to be literally, their evil version of Camelot, with that dictator, right, Adolf, serving as their sort of twisted version of Arthur, right? And so because of all of that, he and the real Arthur in our game were enemies, right? They hated each other. And in the final days of World War II, Arthur was leading the Allied forces into that bunker in Germany, right? Where Adolf had a diesel punk duplicator ray. There was a fight, and those two characters wrestled, and the ray gun went off, creating a bunch of copies of both of those men, right? So Adolf's duplicates each became various supervillains who have appeared in comic books over the years. So the Marvel version of that dictator became known as Hate Monger, right? The DC version of that guy became Dynaman, right? And then there were versions from independent comics who would fight guys like Hellboy and so on and so forth. So the reason for the duplicator thing, the reason why we did that on Earth K was because we have all these things from various comic books all coexisting. And we were trying to explain how that bad guy could have ended up being more than one villain, right? Well, so then likewise, during that struggle, all these duplicates were created of King Arthur. And they also have become various heroes over the years, right? We've been playing the game now for 40 years. And so in that time, we had him in different places doing different things, right? So sometimes he wore a Green Lantern ring, and then there'd be another version, and he would wear quantum bands, and so on and so forth. So right now there is an army of Arthur's duplicates, and they're getting beaten down by an army of Black Lantern versions of Bizarro, because there's an entire planet of Bizarros, right? And one of these guys getting this beat down is Rogue's husband. He's a copy of Arthur who goes by the name Omnius. Another one is the father of the current Dr. Manhattan, right? That Arthur married Janie Slater. One was Superman Red, and he and Super Lion were like old frenemies, right? But the original Arthur finally beats the zombie versions of Dr. Fate and Dr. Strange by using a mother box to run down the clock on how long before their black rings need to be recharged. So the rings lose their power. That ends the animate dead ability that they were using to keep those corpses up and going. So when the rings lose their charge, those cadavers just fall apart, right? And Arthur sees the video that Rogue sent with her cell phone, right, in front of Nekron with tears in her eyes. So he knows what has to be done. And the way his duplicates were created in the DC Heroes role-playing game is there's this power called Split. And this is like the same power that Jamie Madrox has from Marvel. So in the past, we have seen this undone, right? And so we do that again. And so the many versions of Arthur all return to the original as the mother box pings loudly and more frequently. They all remerge. So now instead of having a bunch of heroes and each one has like one famous item from comics, now they're all one guy again, but he is bogged down with like every MacGuffin ever from a comic book, right? And he goes to where Nekron is. And out of game, the players actually cheered. They had absolute faith in the GMPC to find a way to beat Nekron and save the game world, because At this point, they tried and they could not figure anything out. And interestingly enough, our newest player, Brad, turned to me and he says, okay, so how does this go? How does Arthur beat Nekron? And the room falls silent. And I said, I have no idea. And everyone was quiet. You could hear a pin drop. And Brad's unspoken confusion was clear. So I said that when I've played Dungeons and Dragons in the past, something that I despise is right before you enter a room where, say, a vampire is. You find a treasure chest in the room before that, and it's full of wooden stakes. Or you search the bodies in the room and you find a dead cleric who was carrying a vial of holy water, right? And the dungeon master wants you to throw that holy water on the vampire and kill him. And the outcome was already decided before the players even showed up. And in my book, that is absolutely railroading, right? And the whole point of gaming is to give players freedom and encourage them to think outside the box, right? If you don't actually let your players have a choice in things, why are you playing at all? Go watch a movie instead, right? The whole point of role-playing games is interactivity and that your choices matter. So a long time ago, I learned to not come up with how the bad guy is going to be defeated. So that said, I had created this newest incarnation of Necron to be a problem, but even I had not thought up what the solution would be. And if I was reading things correctly, it looked to me like Brad was shocked by this, right? And my wife looked very worried, and she wondered what the chances were that I had decided that the 40th anniversary would be a good time to finally end the game. So she wrestled with the possibility that these characters that she'd grown so attached to over the course of our marriage, which has been more than 20 years now, right? She's been here for more than half of the game now. She wondered if all these characters she's so invested in were just going to end. And my son, who was playing Dr. Manhattan, studied his character sheet and he came up with an idea I had not anticipated. He had, prior to this moment in the game, he had asked earlier if he could substitute his Omni power for powers from TSR's old Marvel superheroes role-playing game. He wanted some of the abilities that were found in the Ultimate Powers book from that system, right? And I told him he had to keep it to DC Heroes only, that if you pay close attention to the description of Omnipower in the DC Heroes role-playing game, it says it can only be subbed for any power, quote unquote, in this book. Referring, of course, to the DC Heroes RPG book where that power is found. So my son asked if he was allowed then to substitute Omnipower for a power in the Blood of Heroes book. Blood of Heroes, by the way, for anyone who doesn't know, was basically intended to be the 4th edition version of DC Heroes after DC Comics seemed to lose the rights to the game system. That whole situation is a very long story, and honestly, it's beyond the scope of today's episode. But suffice it to say, right, they are related, yet different. And Blood of Heroes has Omnipower in that book, right? So suffice it to say, because the chips were down, there's a lot that I'm taking into consideration in this moment. And some of it's in-game stuff and some of it's out-of-game stuff. So I let him do it. So he subbed Omnipower for Power Reserve. And by the way, when it comes to Omnipower, that thing that you get lasts for 2 hours in game. So then on his next turn, he subs Omnipower for a Blood of Heroes ability called Probability Control, which he then boosts with that Power Reserve that he is now going to have for 2 hours, right? Pumping up the probability control to 50 APs. And according to the guys who wrote Blood of Heroes, if you want to use probability control to turn a nuclear missile into like a sperm whale, like we saw in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the opposing number is 40 APs. So by doing this, right, the user can make the impossible possible. So Dr. Manhattan alters reality by rolling the dice, and suddenly Nekron's heart starts beating again, and his cheeks flush with color, and he seems alive. And then next in initiative order was Arthur. And so for Arthur's automatic action, he says, first things first, I want my sword back. And he does the Voltron thing where he sticks his hands out in the air in front of him and he casts summoning, with all of his, like I said, he's got every MacGuffin ever from a comic book. So he brings back Excalibur, right? That's the first thing he does. And then for his dice action, he takes a swing at Nekron's now living neck. And then Arthur rolls double tens in front of everybody, right? And the room went wild. They were so into this moment. Then we roll in the way it works in DC Heroes is you keep that total and then you get to roll again. And on the second time he did it, he rolled a 10 and a 5. And again, this was for all to see, right? So the players were very happy. And not only when I say this was for all to see, not only do I mean in the room where we were playing in real life, but in the game itself, this moment was broadcast on the Jumbotron in Times Square. And it was on every TV in every living room. And it was on every cell phone screen, right? Everybody on Earth K sees this moment, right? And yes, Arthur scored that final blow, right? Where he beheads the number one villain our game has ever seen. But Arthur's son came up with the idea to bring Nekron back to life, right? And it was Rogue, right? The wife who called for help. This was a team effort, in other words. But Arthur was in the middle of it, right? As he always is. And so something a little bit new happens, which is everybody everywhere starts to chant his name. And as they're doing that, Super Lion crushes Nekron's biological head. Dr. Manhattan uses Omnipower to bring a very naked, very burnt Lobo back from the sun. Rogue gives Arthur a kiss, and like I said, he's got a lantern ring on, so there's going to be a force field, skin tight force field there, so that's worth noting as well. And so there's this young hero because it was this massive event, and we had tons of NPCs and stuff like that, right? And so there's a young hero here named Mark Grayson, aka Invincible. And so he says to Arthur, if you're supposed to be, quote unquote, the once and future king, is this it? Is now that time? Is this that future? Because the Shaper of Worlds destroyed the old system. And the old system didn't work anyways, right? And there was so much corruption and bureaucracy, and things had broken down, and the old ways were not working very well. And by the way, if you look back at about our last year worth of stories, whether it's people in the government making Terminators, or people in the government were secretly Skrulls, or whatever, right? You're going to see that all over the game. And people were frustrated. The actual citizens, I mean, they were not only frustrated, they felt defeated, right? And now, for the first time, the whole world feels like it's no longer about, left versus right, but in this moment, it was just about life versus death. And everyone on Earth K right now feels like they're all on the same team. And everybody is looking to Arthur to see what he does, because he's that guy in this specific dimension. He's the guy, right? And so they all look to him to see what he says. So Arthur tells Iron Man there are still hospitals without electricity. And he asks Tony Stark if he'd be willing to set up some arc reactors or something like that. So Tony says he's on it. Arthur tells the Flash to run around and focused on just getting the wounded where they have to go, right? Um, in Mark Grayson, again, he asks Arthur if Arthur is going to be the king, right? And Arthur says, right now I'm not worried about thrones. I'm worried about people in the streets, right? We can talk about politics some other time, but people need help. And so the heroes get to work, and they kind of needed a second just to catch their breath after all the craziness that's been going on. And by the way, we mentioned in a recent game session that Excalibur, according to Marvel continuity, is kind of like the quirk between the world of the living and the world of the dead. So now that Excalibur is back, that it exists again, that kind of quirk exists, if that's how you want to look at it. So the intrusion where these two worlds were kind of becoming this one horrible world, they sort of move apart from each other once more. The veil between worlds gets thicker, and, so on and so forth. And hospitals are restored, to power, and buildings are put back together again by Green Lanterns, and you get the idea. Anything that the Shaper of Worlds tore apart, right? The heroes begin the long process of rebuilding. Which brings us to the epilogue of our 40th anniversary crisis. Back in the year 1999, on Earth K, there was this battle fortress that belonged to an alien named Zor. And it crashed into Earth K, striking South Ateria Island near Japan. And the code name that was given to this mysterious alien ship was the SDF-1. And every country in the world wanted a piece of it. But not only that, it also attracted attention from a group of time travelers who hailed from the middle of the 21st century. And so these soldiers from the future, who were bad guys, showed up wearing armor. and they rode these high-tech motorcycles called a cyclone, and each one could transform and then clamp onto the power armor, turning it into like bulkier, almost like Hulkbuster, kind of stuff, bigger armor that boosted its abilities. And so we ran that game way back when, and those bad guys who were sort of agents of terror. I have to be careful with my wording because of YouTube. But you get what I'm saying, right? They use violence to get their way. They're trying to steal something from the SDF-1 that they were going to use later on. At any rate, they were separated from their gear. Those guys were imprisoned, so on and so forth. And then their equipment was studied. And then at the end of the day, it was stored in the SDF-1, which, by the way, we renamed the Nematon B. And that ship eventually wound up in Tokyo Bay, waist deep in water. And there were two other ships that formed the forearms of it. And one was the Nimitz, and the other was the Yamato. And they were right next to the SDF-1, right? And for decades, the Cyclone Rider armor has just been sitting in the Nematon B, along with some other artifacts from previous games, like Professor Dalton's duplicator ray, which is very much the same kind of thing that I mentioned earlier that created all those clones of King Arthur, right? So now that the crisis is over, the Arthurs have split back into there's lots of them again. They go to the Nematon B and they use the duplicator ray on a Cyclone Rider. And then they basically keep hitting copy and paste so that each one of these Arthur duplicates has his own Saber Cyclone. And the Saber version is my favorite version because the front hubcap of each bike is a gadget akin to Captain America's shield. And then each shield has a function akin to Wolverine's retractable claws. But instead of three separate claws that can pop out, it's just one high-tech sword. So the many clones of King Arthur split up, and each one riding off in a different direction with a bike as his steed, a shield on each arm, and two swords, right? So they're dual wielding. And Earth K still has a ton of villains who need dealt with. And the military no longer has any equipment. The police, are basically no more. So now, for the moment, we're trying this out. We're seeing what we think of it. We're starting to get this thing with Arthur's Knights happening, right? That's beginning to take shape. And we mentioned in previous games, even before all of this, that Arthur formed a round table. And that all the guys at that round table are basically from 80s cartoons that had their own toy line. And each one is like the main good guy from that respective toy line, right? So it'd be like Optimus Prime from Transformers is on the round table. Lion-O from Thundercats. He-Man from Masters in the Universe, right? So in terms of having a round table, that's not bad. You know what I mean? Like, that's a pretty good group of guys to have on one team. And then through all of this, one of the things we're doing is we're saying, if you look at actual Arthurian mythology, they had guys like the Green Knight, right? That just sounds like a comic book name, like Green Arrow or Green Lantern, Green Knight. the Black Knight, so on and so forth. Um, they had powers. Some of them had secret identities. They had headquarters. You know what I mean? I think there's a strong argument to be had that King Arthur is the world's first superhero. And he exists in Marvel and DC, right? And and we mentioned before too that there's all these comic books where Batman and Superman actually met King Arthur and took the knee in front of him and he knighted them. The Fantastic Four have met King Arthur, so on and so forth. He's that one guy that if you really wanted unity, he's a pretty darn good fit, right? But so where that is how the crisis ends, is we are hinting that maybe that's where this is going, is we're finally doing the once and future king. But we're going to see how people like it. Nothing's set in stone yet. Right now, honestly, things are weird. It's like in a lot of Transformers episodes, there'd be some big cataclysm. And then for the next few episodes, you see the Transformers literally rebuilding cities and stuff like that. That's where we're at right now. We don't know what Earth K is going to look like once it's fully rebuilt. Um, so we're going to revisit that. So let's put a pin in some of that for now. Um, but yeah, that was it. That was the big crisis for the 40th anniversary. We really enjoyed this game. There were parts where people were laughing. Some of the Lobo stuff had people literally in tears, begging that the jokes would stop so that they could breathe. Um, People cheered. I can't remember the last time a game was met with applause, but this one actually was. People were high-fiving. It was very well received. We loved playing this one. I hope that you guys enjoyed hearing about it. If so, as always, you know the routine, right? Smash that like button. Make sure that you're subscribed because YouTube loves to unsubscribe you and not tell you. And then last but not least, leave us a comment. And for sure in this one, let me know what you think. Should we do the once and future king? Should this turn into a thing of like the Amazons start to bring the purple ray into the world where everybody has access to it? It starts to cure every disease. Should the Tony Starks and Reed Richards of the world make flying cars? Um, you know what I mean? And should we start to do the idea of Earth K? The K stands for King Arthur, or the K stands for the kingdom. And we start doing stuff with high-tech knights with lightsabers, and maybe we start to colonize other planets, and you know what I mean? Let me know what you think of that. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. And of course, the still is we can have um plenty of stuff to fight, right? It's not like I'm suggesting things get boring. Just kind of making this a little more Elseworlds than it has been, you know. And again, we have the Earth H channel now. Check that out. That is sort of the more traditional stuff is there for sure. One way or another, that's going to be there. But yeah, I'd be very curious to hear your comments. Let me know because you guys have the same things too. Um, but yeah, that's it for me for this one. From everybody here at the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure.